Vincent. She is the Managing Director of the Center for Connection Play Strong Institute in Pasadena, headed by Executive Director Dr. Tina Payne-Bryson. And Tina is also the co-author of The Whole Brain Child. She actually spoke at one of our CFA meetings previously. So the CFC Play Strong Institute is a center for child and adolescent therapy, therapeutic school support, and social skills group informed by the latest research-based techniques and focused on helping children and families thrive. Georgie is a frequent speaker for parents and for professional groups interested in learning about her Play Strong model for trauma and stress, resilience, parenting with the brain in mind, and the neurobiology of play and relationships. So without further ado, I'd like to bring up Georgie.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Stephanie, for that warm introduction. I'm so pleased to be here. I was excited about this all day. I am very lucky to work at the Center for Connection with Tina, Dr. Bryson. She is an incredible mind and has taught me so much about the brain and the mind and relationships, and so that is the lens that I want to speak from tonight with you. And also just because, you know, I'm a parent too. I have a 4-year-old son, and so I kind of know how it is. And so coming to these parent education evenings is such a nice time to just get information, start thinking about the way that we're parenting, maybe even slightly differently, but also just to nourish yourselves and to know that a lot of what you're already doing as parents is working so well and is backed up by the research, actually. Let me go ahead and teaching them how to be innovators. And I say that kind of tongue-in-cheek because, as I'll explain a little bit later, we don't really have to teach kids how to innovate. They kind of come that way. But I'm going to go ahead and just jump in here. And I'm going to keep hopping back and forth to switch my slides. I'm going to be talking about actually collaborating with our kids as the key to developing resilience. Something that they say over and over again in the Whole Brain Child, if any of you have read it or read chapters 1 through 3, which is what parents always tell me. I've read chapters 1 through 3. Beyond that, I don't know if I have time to finish the whole thing, but there's so much good stuff even in chapters 1 through 3. Tina and Dan Siegel, who's a psychiatrist at UCLA and developed this whole movement of interpersonal neurobiology, which is it's taken center stage as far as how we're thinking in mental health and the counseling field about the best ways to help children. It's completely revamped my thinking as well. They say that when we're thinking about our kids' brains and the way that brains develop, we need to understand that neurons that fire together wire together. And what sorts of things actually shape the way kids' brains are developing, it's all based on experiences. Is sitting with their granddad and reading a story, or if they walk by the neighbor's yard and the dog runs up to the fence and starts barking at them. Positive and negative experiences are all happening in equal measure on the brain. It's the strongest experiences that end up being wired in stronger ways. So we just want to pay attention to the way brains are getting wired as we talk together. So it's all going to be through the lens of brain science and neurodevelopment. So we as parents have such opportunity on a daily basis. The moment-to-moment experiences that we share with our kids as we're parenting, as we're making choices together with them, sometimes we're making choices for them, are going to have an impact on their lives. But even the types of relationships that we're developing with our children, or the relationships that they're developing with their siblings or extended family members, are all having an effect on the way their brains are growing. And I'm going to talk a little bit tonight about different parts of the brain without, saying so much about the brain that it starts to get so heavy. But how relationships could create healthy connections between different parts of the brain that has different functions, and that linkage and the integration between the way that those parts are working is what's really important. Just like if your child is going to school, different departments or different teachers or different parts of the classroom or different peers that they're interacting with, if those relationships are functionally linked and they're working well together, and there's not too much chaos or too much rigidity, that's what we're really going for in terms of healthy connection. And that's kind of the ideal. So I just want to take a minute and talk about the definition of what I mean by the mind, the brain, and relationships. So interpersonal neurobiology is predicated on the notion that the brain is sort of like the hardware of how we accept energy and the flow of information from our environment. So the brain kind of takes all the information in. And the nervous system, which is not listed here, but the nervous system is our embodied brain. So it's how our brain is connected to all the other parts of our bodies, particularly the major organs of the body. Functionally work together is the nervous system. And then the mind is the part of our brain that does the thinking. It's more of a conceptual brain. And the mind is really concerned with regulating the flow of energy and information. In terms of our thinking. And then the relationships are the way that we share information with each other. So I just wanted to say that at the outset so we really are on the same page. And that all these things, the mind, the brain, and relationships, if they're all working well together, we sort of call that healthy functioning. So, someone was asking me before this talk, why is there RPT-S behind your name? What does that mean? And I just wanted to let everybody know that I'm a play therapist. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, but I'm also credentialed as somebody who is a professional in using play with children to help them recover from difficult experiences. Now that's really my specialty within the Center for Connection. So I'm like the major player, so to speak, at the CFC. But I also am lucky because we recently expanded our services to include this whole other location where we have 7 play therapy rooms and enough staff to see children who find it difficult to make full use of the other talk-based therapy methods, whether they're too young or their emotions might be too overwhelming, whether they're constantly under so much stress that it's hard for them to access. The types of therapies where you need to sit down on the sofa and actually talk to a therapist. This kind of service is open to families who just have questions, or maybe you're wondering if something that's going on with your child is that normal for their development, or maybe you and your child are not always seeing eye to eye and you feel like something's a little bit out of whack or something. We have a team of play therapists that are eager to help you. So I just wanted to mention play because that's kind of my area of specialty and how it integrates back in. I just want to talk about what happens when kids have resilience already built in. Resilience being their ability to sort of weather the storm and bounce back from difficulty. And I want to take you back a few years now. We've just observed again the 9/11 tragedy. And when 9/11 happened, there were a lot of kids who were exposed to trauma from that experience. I know all of us really were as we were watching events that were unfolding in the news, or we might have even been, I know some people that were actually in New York at the time that it all happened, or had friends or relatives that were very close to the site. So many kids were actually at ground zero, or they were at home watching the news with their parents, or they had seen the looks on adults' faces that were terrified or horrified by what was happening. And these kids, they were having trouble, and one of the first ways that we can tell that kids are having trouble after a major incident like this, and when I see the events on the news, like in Thousand Oaks, and we've had wildfires, and there's so much that kids are constantly exposed to in terms of disaster out there, that it just reminds me of this powerful story that happened with 9/11. Children were actually having such trouble afterwards in the sort of recovery area, or the response teams that went out, that they actually invited play therapists to come out and play with them to see if they could make a difference. Many of the kids, and sometimes when I give a talk like this, I'll have blocks with me so that I can actually demonstrate what it looked like. It's very powerful to see it. But a couple of boys in particular were sort of building block towers at a table. They just build 2 towers over and over again and then consistently just push them, knock them down. So they were repetitively playing the same scene over and over again. They were repetitively affected by the image of the Twin Towers coming down. And nobody knew exactly how to help these kids, because sometimes when kids are shaken that much by what they've experienced firsthand, or there's been some vicarious trauma, we don't really know how to, sometimes we feel like, how do we find the words? How do we talk to them? How do we reach them? But luckily, play therapists were brought in who knew exactly the skills and techniques to use to help. So out of that, I've sort of developed skills to help even teach parents how to help process things that kids have gone through without having to talk about it necessarily. This was profiled on NPR, that 2 boys in particular were knocking down block towers over and over again. They were in the midst of this traumatized play. And when the play therapist came in, the boys suddenly were able to access more of their natural resilience. And so 2 boys in particular, I know in this example it says dinosaurs, but 2 of the boys in particular decided that they were going to, in their imagination, in the imaginary play, they were going to break the animals out of the New York Zoo, and they were going to have the animals take 1 block at a time and rebuild each tower. So first a tiger came and got 1 block and set it down, and then the lion came along. Sometimes these animals would have normally fought with each other and stuff. But it was sort of this message of hope that, then the lion could set a block on top, and then maybe the giraffe would come and do another, and a panda bear another, koala, penguin. And finally, these animals who had been let loose on the city had completed rebuilding the Twin Towers. And what they noticed was, after the play therapist came in and the boys were able to rebuild, they didn't play it anymore, and they went back to their normal, healthy lives. Trauma had never happened. And I get chills every time I say this, because we now know, based on the research, what happened at the level of these kids' brains when they were able to access their creativity and their imagination, which is just typical of boys of that age, girls of that age, children of that age. They were able to come up with a solution that no adult would have thought of, because as we know, in reality, the Twin Towers were never rebuilt, right? It was just a memorial there now. So the children were actually able to dream up, with their imagination, a way that they could then rework their memory. Because trauma is all based on the way we store a memory, or the felt sense of the event that happened to us that shook us up so much. So the memory changed. And now that we know, based on the science, what happened inside the brain and the mind was that the new memory of rebuilding these block towers with these animals, these rogue zoo animals, actually replaced, the new memory has actually replaced the old memory of destruction and devastation. It's incredible. I always get kind of choked up when I talk about this. And so part of this just reminds me how resilient kids naturally actually are, but part of it also is sort of a reminder that there's so much that we can do as parents, as teachers, as people who care about children, to make sure that kids already have resilience built in, that ability to sort of like stick with it when things get tough, or bounce back after something really hard has happened. We can build it in from the get-go. Combat not only, God forbid they have to go through a trauma, but just everyday stress and anxiety that pops up just by being kids. So I want to take you through some of my thinking as we're doing this work and we're studying more at the Center for Connection. First of all, and I'm a little biased because I am a play therapist, but I do believe that play is a foundation and one of our best defenses against childhood trauma. I like that you're taking pictures of this slide. I think it's our best defense against childhood trauma, but there are so many helpful influences when traumatic events have occurred that I don't want to discount all the rest of them. They're all very important. But the Play Strong Institute is currently working on developing a method that we can teach to any adult that parents, cares for, or comes in contact with kids that could either be trauma responsive, so even the Red Cross volunteers could learn how to do this, and when they're responding to things like the wildfires, all the volunteers would know how to play with kids in a way that would help them recover faster. If homes have been damaged, if families have been displaced. All the way to the everyday ways that we play together with our kids. I know a lot of parents say, I don't have time, I get bored quickly, my kids are too old now to play. There's all these things, and I know as well, because I have a 4-year-old, and when he pulls out the marble run for the 15th time that day, I'm sort of like, oh my gosh, I can't. Laundry to do, sorry, I can't stick around. But really, like, how can we spend, and I'm letting you in on our trade secrets right now, but how can we spend about 15 minutes a day of really resilient strengthening play with our kids as a basis and a foundation, in addition to all the other things that we do to help talk through our kids through problems and help them figure out challenges and stresses that come up throughout the day as well. All of those things are helpful. But really, we're working towards helping kids learn to really think through how they can be active agents when they're faced with problems. And that, I think, is sort of like the key strategy that I want to talk about today, because when I'm working with kids in play therapy, one of the first indicators that I can see of whether a child is going to be able to get through something really difficult much faster is their level of creativity. Their ability not just to sit back and go, oh my gosh, there's no way, I can't think of anything that I can do. But when they're given an opportunity to think about, this problem keeps happening over and over again, and how do you think we can solve it? The kids that are able to go, well, I can think of 10 ways to solve it, I just need support from adults to choose the best one for me. Those are the kids that I find are just they're jamming through their therapy. They're amazing. And I want every kid to be able to do that, to be able to think for themselves, not just sort of go, okay, what's the skill that you're teaching me today? Okay, I'll try it. But then 9 times out of 10, those skills don't work when kids are in the heat of the moment and they're sort of overwhelmed by the stressful situation. And we kind of wonder why, but I'm going to explain a little bit more about why that might be happening. Rise. We're seeing higher levels of stress and anxiety in kids from all the ages that your kids would be attending a school like this. From about the age of 3, we're starting to notice younger and younger, all the way up through high school and even college. It was reported in the American Journal of Play. They believe, because I'm a play therapist, again, I'm going to go back to these statistics, but they believe that part of the higher rates of depression and anxiety that we're seeing in kids is related to the decline of free play. And also that generally, and I know this school is probably very progressive in its views of assigning, not assigning too much work and wanting kids to foster a sense of balance in their lives. But when we compare over the last 30 years, kids are spending 145% more time doing schoolwork than my generation when I was a kid. They're also only getting, on average, about 11 hours of free play a week, and that includes screen time. And when I think about the kids that come and see me in my office, I would say most of that free time is probably screen time, actually. So I'm not trying to create a causal link between all of these things. I'm just interested in how these things might be associated with one another. And I'm concerned about how stressful life can be for some kids, or how they're manifesting stress and anxiety. Things that sometimes parents feel like they shouldn't be this stressed, but they do seem more overwhelmed than I would expect them to be. So what's that all about? So everybody knows the difference between stress, anxiety, and trauma, right? Yeah. Let's say stress is just like, if you can imagine your kid or you are a sailboat on the ocean. Stress is just like, okay, there's a temporary gust of wind that's just kind of blowing me a little harder than I want to be blown. Maybe it's rocking my boat a little bit, but I know that that's temporary. I'll probably get through it. It's not going to last forever. Things are just hard right now, and then the gust of wind goes away, and we feel better again. There's also positive stress, by the way. It's really good for all of us to experience some level of stress, right? At different points of our lives. One person is shaking his head. We don't even want positive stress. But positive stress would be like, okay, I see a big wave coming, and I'm feeling confident enough that I could probably make it over that wave, and then you sort of do, right? Anxiety is where it feels like it may be a perfectly sunny day, there may just be a small gust of wind blowing, but anxiety is where kids are feeling like this is a bigger storm than what I can handle, and that they feel that on a daily basis, or they feel that in multiple different situations. Anybody, if you've ever seen a kid that's sort of like, wow, it seems like your perception is that things are much more stressful than they seem to be to anyone else looking at this situation. That would be more anxiety. That's also associated with kids who tend to avoid stuff or avoid the same things over and over again. It's like, okay, we signed up for swimming lessons, and you liked the first swimming lesson, but now it seems like you never want to go when it's time to go to swimming lessons, and there are big tears and meltdowns and stuff like that, and then you keep wanting to skip swimming lessons. So situational anxiety. But broader anxiety is like, there are patterns of things that really cause stress and overwhelm quickly and repetitively. And then trauma, I just wanted to mention the ACEs study. Has everybody heard about the ACEs study at this stage? It's been in the news a lot. Basically, back in the mid-90s, Kaiser and the CDC paired up. They got together, and they decided to do a broad study of medical patients that had come through the Kaiser system, and they just gave them a questionnaire about their adverse childhood experiences, and that could be anything from child abuse to alcoholism in the family, lots of different things that we would categorize as like things that might have happened to you as a child that would be an adverse experience, but an intense one. And they asked people they asked people how many ACEs they had or how many traumatic situations in their childhood they had. And then they followed these patients in a longitudinal study and are still following them to see what happened to them over the course of their lifespans. And they found that even having one ACE in your history, and the more ACEs you had, the more complex the picture looked. But even having one ACE put people more at risk for long-term health, negative health factors, such as heart disease, more likely to smoke or drink alcohol, diabetes, need for mental health support, all of these things. So there's a longer-term implication with trauma, and trauma is much more in the news, although most of us will probably never go through a trauma. It's something that we just need to keep in mind as we're working with kids, because sometimes kids are reacting to situations as if they're going through something traumatic. And it's often like way beyond what you would, they're having this emotional reaction where it's like way beyond what you would expect as typical for a kid, kid normally developing. Wow, where did that come from? So we need tools to help kids through these situations. If they're having big anxiety or almost what seems like an over-exaggerated reaction to situations. So the long-term view is that we want to foster creative resilience in our kids in order to help them deal better with temporary stresses. Anxiety, we don't want anxiety to develop. We don't want kids to be more prone to anxiety. And we definitely want to give them tools to be able to work toward prevention of bigger traumas, but also help them recover faster if, my goodness, something were to happen. A few years ago, there was a tree that fell over in a park in Pasadena, and some of you are nodding your heads, you remember this. And there were a few injuries, and there were many kids that were there in the park that day, and they were affected by this, and thankfully they ended up processing this in in therapy or with someone at school, and they were able to get through it. But in case anything like that does happen, I want every child to be able to have the building blocks of what they need, or to have adults in their lives who know how to respond to help them get through those situations and feel like, okay, we're putting the world back in order again after this happens. But what are the characteristics that we want to instill in our kids so that, goodness forbid, anything like that were to happen? What would they already have on board? Be able to stay calm in the storm. The kid who's able to look at stress and go, you know what? I'm not overwhelmed by this. Actually, this is a challenge that I want to take on, and I know where to get help in order to do this. You know, I can do this, but I might need a little bit of help because I'm still just a kid. We want kids that are strong thinkers and makers. We want them to be able to collaborate in relationships. I want those kids to come up with their own innovative ideas of what's going to help as well. Not just I'm depending on adults to tell me what kind of help is available and how I might use it. And then, or sometimes like I have to accept the help that adults are offering me and their version of it. But I want them to be innovative and thinking and like driven and passionate about finding solutions. And I want kids to have the ability to bounce back and recover quickly in case anything adverse did happen to them. By the way, all of these qualities are what the Fortune 500 CEOs want in their new applicants, in the new generation of workforce that's coming through in this economy. To have a stronger economy moving forward, the economy of the future is all going to be based on innovation. We have more, all the teachers in the back of the room are nodding their head. I was sitting with a teenager several months ago, and he was saying to me, you know, at school, he's about 16, he was like, at school, they're telling me that all of the jobs are soon going to be replaced by robots because there's so much more technology. Like, there's so many jobs that are going to be replaced by robots that the only way I'm going to get a high-paying job is if I learn how to build and fix robots. So I want to learn how to code, I want to like study business, I want to be at the forefront of the economy. And so I know that like many parents are worried about, I need to make sure that my child is academically successful and I want them to go to the best Ivy League school, and that is our definition of success. But I think in the next generation of economic stability, we are going to need people who don't just accept like the answers that teachers give them, but the kids that are going to be able to grow into adults who are innovative and can outthink and build robots or help us colonize Mars, for example, are going to be the kids that are most successful. And that can start with emotional resilience, actually, in the way that we parent our kids and the way we interact with them on a daily basis, if we're thinking within that mindset. My neighbor is a Mars geologist. She works at JPL over in La Cañada. And every time I see her, I think I'm just going to say like, hey, how's your dog? And she is always telling me that she's like working on a new project, like, well, there's actually like a deep crater in the moon where Neil Armstrong initially landed. And my job, I'm heading up a team of people that are going to actually like build a rover that's going to be able to put a scope down in that crater so that we can see if there's any way that we could actually colonize both Mars or the moon one day. And I'm like, when is this actually going to be possible, Laura? Like, when could we actually think about colonizing Mars or the moon? And she's like, I don't know, it could be like 50 or 60 years, but they're already thinking about it. So I think if we're going to be looking at our kids' emotional health, and we're going to be thinking about what are they going to need to succeed in the economy of 10, 20 years from now, we need to be thinking like NASA and JPL. We need to give them the skills now that they're going to need then. And I think of that even in emotional terms, like their emotional foundation as well. So, how do we do it? Tina and Dan have written these incredible books. Their most recent book, The Yes Brain, is all about what kids need to succeed. They've talked to hundreds of parents. We've all worked with many, many families over the years. And they've looked at the research. And really what the research shows is in terms of emotional resilience and what kids need in order to be able to tackle the problems of this next generation, they need It's BRIE is the acronym, like the brie, the cheese. That's an easy way to remember it. Balance. That means knowing how much to take on, not building in too many extracurricular activities, but having a healthy platter of activities throughout their weeks and their years. Resilience, which is what I'm going to talk about today. Bounce. Insight, the ability to reflect, self-reflect on how am I doing? Who am I? What do I want to be doing? What are my goals? And then be able to have insight into other people and understand the way other people think and understanding different perspectives. I know that's, in this political climate, it's now more important than ever that people grow up with the skills to be able to understand diverse opinions and respect the opinions and perspectives of others. And empathy, just our basic emotional ability to know what it's like to be in another person's shoes, but also to have their emotions resonate with us in a way that could maybe change the way we interact with them or the way we show our caring and compassion. A big way to boost empathy in our kids, by the way, I was just having this conversation with the executive director of a new organization called Project Giving Kids, which is it's a website that will soon be an app. That helps connect families with opportunities for kids to do charity work and volunteer even at younger ages. Because a lot of parents are telling me, I want my kids to volunteer. Like, I want to take them to a soup kitchen on Christmas Eve and like serve, serve food. It's the simplest thing in the world to give people a warm meal at the holidays. But a lot of these organizations, they're not organized in order to accept younger children or even, older elementary or middle school students to come in and just serve food. But Project Giving Kids is trying to bridge that gap. And I think community service at younger and younger ages, doing that as a family, not just, I know schools organize events and they accept donations and they make sure that we are constantly thinking about serving others in need and instilling that. But when families do it, I think it's so important for the development of empathy. And just to give you another brain factoid, it actually strengthens the supramarginal gyrus. That's the part of the brain that is really growing when we demonstrate empathy and when we feel compassion for others. Just another brain factoid. I mentioned before that we need to make sure our kids are innovators, but we actually don't need to teach them how to innovate. So going to the child development research, babies are actually natural innovators. That's how they develop. From the time that our children are born, everything that they do is an experiment to try and learn and develop and grow. So George Land was a psychologist back in the 1960s. NASA hired him to develop a creativity test in order to test their scientists. They didn't want to know who's the smartest scientist, who comes from the best school, who has the best grades, all of those things. We need people who are going to be out-of-the-box thinkers to be able to solve problems. In those days, it was like, we just had a generation that landed on the moon. We need the next generation to be ready to do the next thing. So they tested all their scientists to see who's the most creative. And this creativity test is available online, by the way. It's like 15 to 20 questions. It's really simple. It's questions like, here's the number 150. See how many ways you can write it down. That's it. They just wanted to see how many different ways could a person solve problems. And time test, so you have to do it fast. What they found was that NASA scientists were, creative to an extent. Then Dr. Land decided, this test is so simple, I could give it to 4- and 5-year-olds. So he did. He went to an early Head Start program and he gave a certain sample size of 4- and 5-year-olds the same test. And what he found was 98% of them were as creative as NASA scientists, right? They're incredibly fast at solving problems, and they have to in order to develop, right? Because they babble before they talk and they crawl before they walk. Our kids are innovating on a daily basis. We're not even noticing it because most of our kids are typically developing, so we just kind of take it for granted, the amazing things that babies are actually doing. But Alison Gopnik is not taking it for granted because she is one of the head researchers at the UC Berkeley Child Development Lab, and she's written a number of books. Has anybody read The Carpenter and the Gardener? Gardener and the Carpenter? I can't remember which way that goes. She has done research on infants and toddlers in her lab, not harmful research, it doesn't hurt. She just invites babies and their parents to come into the lab, and they sit down with an interviewer and they give them problems to solve to see if these babies are any good at solving problems. And they also want to understand the roots of things like, when does empathy switch on in the brain and things like this, stuff that's fascinating. She's done TED Talks and stuff, so you can look her up, Alison Gopnik, if you want to. Anyway, she devised this experiment where there was colored blocks. They are clear to start with, but when you stack them on top of each other, they light up a different color. And if you get them in the right formation, in the right order, the top one will light up pink, let's say, and then you know you've got them in the right order. And the order is, there's no specific order, it's just whatever the researcher decided was going to be the correct. But you have to line them up in a very particular way. So she tested how fast toddlers could do this work. And then she tested adults to see how long it took them to get them in the right order. And what she noticed was adults would kind of like do the 4 blocks and then kind of look at it and go, no, that didn't work. I wonder what the problem could be. You know, like, and then they'd like study it for a while, and then they'd take it down, and then they'd think about it, and then they get frustrated, and that would take longer and stuff. And it was like this arduous process for adults to figure out this order. Toddlers didn't do that. Do you know what they did? Knock it down, do it again, knock it down, do it again, knock it down, do it again. They were driven to find the right pattern. And they got there faster. And so these 4-year-olds could actually solve these problems faster than adults. Why? Because our brains are slower. Not necessarily. I'll talk about why there are differences between kid brains and adult brains. But the point I want to make is, if our kids already start out as innovators and we want them to be innovators, what is getting in the way? Is it us? No. As a play therapist, I want to clear myself out of the way. I want kids to maintain this way of being driven, being passionate about finding answers, thinking up solutions for themselves, not getting bogged down in like being worried about making mistakes, for example. I just want them to keep trying and doing and experimenting. And it doesn't matter if it's right or wrong. The important thing is that you're trying and that you care about this and that you want to be successful, and you will get there. So those are the kinds of things that I want to instill. But again, I don't have to instill it. I just have to make sure that I don't interrupt it in any sort of a way, as a parent and as a professional. So let's talk about different parts of the brain now, because I'm really fascinated with how we achieve brain integration. Integration is really key. It's sort of one of the key words that I'm going to mention today, because the whole brain child is all about integration. Does anybody know the difference between the left brain and the right brain? I mean, this is like popular science now. When we're talking about, you know, oh, left brain people are more like accountants and right brain people are more like artists or something. Like, that's what we've all heard, and there's quizzes on Facebook to tell whether you're more left brain or more right brain. Actually, that's all kind of hogwash. Nobody is more left brain than right brain. A healthy developing mind is one in which both hemispheres of the brain work well together. We want the left brain and the right brain to be equally strong and to be able to complement each other and work to help each other, so to speak. To talk to each other, if you will. But the left brain, as you can see from the diagrams, the left brain is more logical, linear, linguistic, and literal. It also loves that the list of words that I just said all start with L. It loves order, the left brain. It's also concerned with factual memory. It really cares about making sure that all the facts are lined up. The right hemisphere, however, is more interested in the senses and emotion of an experience. It loves randomness as opposed to order. It's kind of the polar opposite of the left brain. It loves looking at the whole picture rather than getting caught up and focused on a particular detail of a situation. And it's very good at autobiographical memory. And when we have any experience, that experience first gets shuttled from the brainstem to the right brain, actually. So if you put your right hand on the side of your head, that's your right brain right there. Left hand on the left side of your head, that's your left brain. When kids get overwhelmed, a lot of times we talk about the right brain being activated with an emotional tsunami. And when kids are too pedantic or too in their own heads, or too focused on details, like those perfectionist kids, sometimes they're overusing the left hemisphere of their brain. But we want to remember that anytime kids are having a strong emotional experience, we need to connect with the right brain first, rather than focus on the details of the left brain. And I want to talk about how each of the different hemispheres stores memories as well, because if we're talking about the left hemisphere, the left is looking at the facts, and the right is looking at the autobiographical parts of this memory, like, what meaning is this situation, or this calling up that memory to me? When you think about your first day of kindergarten, for example, like I remember walking into Mrs. Wilson's classroom, and I came in and my mom sort of ushered me in and took me to a desk that had my name on it. And I remember like all the steps of what I did to get there. Like I got up that morning and my mom like had me brush my teeth, and I got dressed and I got my Sesame Street lunchbox, and it had Big Bird on it, and you know, all those things, and the way it smelled like bananas because bananas were left too long in the lunchbox. All those little facts are what the left brain records. But the right brain records like, how did I feel? You know, when my mom was dropping me, that was the first time maybe that I'd ever been at that school or met that teacher or seen. I remember being very concerned with the fact that my name was on the desk. Like, did the teacher already know me? Did she? Like, that's autobiographical memory, right? The way we felt at the time that the event happened. And that's where we need both sides of our brain to help integrate an experience, like a tree falling over at the park, or even 9/11, stuff that shakes us up. We need to make sure that the right brain and the left brain are in good balance, and so we can help our kids do that if they're getting out of balance because the right brain is overreacting, let's say. So Tina and Dan talk about one strategy to help our kids when they're getting overwhelmed in the right brain by an experience. We can tell the story with them with the name it to tame it strategy. Has anybody read about this in The Whole Brain Child? Okay, so I'll just summarize it really quickly. If you have a situation where your kid, and I'm thinking specifically about a situation with my own son where he hated putting shoes on when he was like 2 or 3 years old. How many of your kids hated wearing shoes? Yeah, shoes are traumatic when you're 2 sometimes. But there was one time when I was putting his shoe on, and he'd actually like overnight like outgrown the shoe by just that much. And so what fit him the day before didn't fit him the next day, and I was trying to get it on. And I was like, why isn't this thing working? I'm like trying to get his little heel to go in and stuff. And he actually like kicked the shoe, and like it flung, and it hit me in the head, and we both were sort of a mess after that happened. We were both very much in our right brains after that happened. But he was really upset about it for like the rest of the day, and he was saying, I will never wear shoes again, basically. He was like, nope, not gonna go back there. And so what I did was I used the name it to tame it strategy with him. Like, you know, we tried to put your shoes on. The name it to tame it strategy is like meeting the right brain first, connecting with that right brain, like rubbing his back, going, you know, we tried to put the shoe on and it wasn't going on, and you were it was hurting your foot, it was squeezing your foot, and I was getting frustrated, and then I gave that one last push and you kicked it off, and it got me right in the head, and we were both upset. But then, you know, I took the shoe away, and we, like, you know, I rubbed your foot a little bit. So there's this story that you tell where you talk about what was so difficult about that situation, were about it, and then how you were able to recover from it, or how you were able to repair. And a lot of times parents will use this technique when you've just gotten so frustrated that you've sort of lost, you know, you've lost control of your right brain as well, and got really frustrated, and they've seen that. It's a way of repairing that rupture after it happens. But really, we're pairing the left brain with the right brain. So we're switching on the left brain. This is what happened, and this was the order. But these are the emotions that were connected to this situation. And we want to make sure that both of those things get integrated so that you can get past whatever just happened and get integrated with it. Because we do have different brains than our kids, actually. I mean, does anybody know how many, well, I want to ask that. How many neurons your baby, a newborn has, like the day that he or she is born? How many neurons in the brain? Any guesses? Just throw a number out there.
100,000.
100,000. 70 million. Good guess. Anybody else? A billion. It's 100 billion, I think, last time I checked. That is all the neurons that your child is ever going to need in their entire life. They have 100 billion, more or less, depending on what they do as teenagers. But so if they already have all the neurons that they need when they're born, what part of the brain actually grows and develops over the course of your lifetime? Did you ever think about it? There are these connections that form between neurons or bundles of neurons that create neural networks and pathways that help with things like going from being able to addition to complex multiplication to calculus. They get more and more, the neural pathways get more and more complex as we grow. But it's the synaptic connections between neurons that actually grow. They actually skyrocket after a baby's born up until the age of 2. So 2-year-olds actually have double the number of synaptic connections, the connections between neurons that they'll actually need, which is why when you cut your 2-year-old's muffin in half, they sort of freak out and go right into their right brain because they think you've given them less of a muffin because there's 2 smaller pieces instead of 1 whole piece. They're not necessarily connected fully with that logical part of the brain that needs to come online after the fact. So our brains keep developing, and for some of you have teenagers or preteens in middle school at this point. Anybody have a middle school student here? Yeah. I'll talk about them in just a second too, because their brains are interesting as well, what's going on in their brains. But our brains keep developing over the lifespan, and actually they become more, our synaptic connections become more complex. They get bundled, and they turn into these superhighways, whereas the brain of a 2-year-old is more like a pinball machine, where a neural message can get sent out, and then it's kind of trying to find its way through this complex network that may not necessarily end up at the location that it needs to understand that the muffin is still all the same amount of muffin. You know, just because I cut it in half, you're not getting less muffin. Adult brains become so highly sophisticated and specialized, and there's this process of pruning that happens along the way too. The strongest connections survive, and the weaker connections actually get sort of sloughed off, and they disintegrate because we're not using them. So it's almost as if city planners came and they decided we're going to build freeways here, and we're going to actually wipe out old streets that aren't being used or in disrepair. So now we have a 405 freeway that actually things run really smoothly. It's not quite, I know that's not possible ever. But imagine that. That's what an adult brain is like. And messages flow really easily from different parts of the brain up to the uppermost part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, which is in charge of all of our executive functioning, like how to think ahead, how to plan for what's happening tomorrow or next year, how to create organized systems of organization, how to make wise decisions, not just knee-jerk reactions, but how to think about and reflect on what we're doing as adults or as parents. Our upstairs brains, our prefrontal cortexes are so valuable to the parenting process. Because imagine if we just parented according to however we felt that day or whatever impulse popped into our heads, right? We'd be taking them to circus in Vegas every day, whatever strikes your fancy. That's what we'd be doing as parents if we weren't so top-down thinkers. So it's really good that we are top-down thinkers, that a lot of our thinking comes from the more sophisticated, specialized top parts of our brains. The problem is that our kids' brains are developing from the bottom up, but they have much stronger downstairs brains. I'm going to talk about what that means. But actually, when babies are born, the lowest parts of their brain, if we're looking at the brain as sort of down here versus up here, our strength is coming from up here, neurologically speaking, but our babies, their brains are mostly fully formed starting down here. I'll talk about what I mean. I need another slide to explain this. But this is where we clash, because kids are often making decisions based on sudden reactions to things, their impulses, what's driving their development, is just like, do, new ideas, try this, I want this now, can I have it, why not? It's like, that's the lower brain at work, and I'm going to say more about that as we go. You can see this mother and this little girl are obviously disagreeing. She's actually saying, and my friend Yoli is an artist who drew these for me, actually, so these are originals. But she's actually going, no, I'm fine with my tea party right now. And Mom's like, but dinner's on the table, it's getting cold. You can see the difference between the bottom-up development and the top-down thinking of clash over the way we think. I know it happens with me and my 4-year-old all day long. I'm like, why can't you be a top-down thinker? Especially when kids are playing, and I want to maintain as much as possible the creative innovation of our kids, and so I have to go back to play and their playful selves when I talk about this, especially for our younger children. How many of you are parents of, I don't know, pre-K, kindergartners? Yeah, these guys are almost all the way driven by their lower brain right now. I'm sorry to say. It's going to take a while until all those top parts of the brain fully develop. Does anybody know how long it takes, how many years it takes for your top brain, your upstairs brain to get fully developed? 18, 25, 36. They say that boys and girls, like their hardware is maturing at the same rate, but sometimes the emotional maturity and some of the software, the mindfulness and that sort of thing takes a little bit longer in boys, but I'll touch on that when I get to the adolescent brain, because there are some gender differences in terms of brain functioning and development by the time we get into the preteen, pre-adolescent years. But actually, it does take your prefrontal cortex about 30 years to fully mature, 30 years. So your kids might be living with you longer than you think. No, it's true. We are seeing that this millennial generation is actually living at home longer, staying on parents' health benefits, waiting until they get that perfect job before they enter the workforce, that kind of thing. And we're noticing that might be linked with what we know about the maturity of the upstairs brain. The playful brain, again, my friend Yoli did this illustration just to help me illustrate to you what your child's brain is like in its most creative state. So when creativity is happening and it's amazing, like they're building that organic chemistry model at the age of 8 or something, or like my son today, he decided, I'm going to be a scientist when I grow up, so I want to get my watercolor paints, and I want to get these little beakers, and I want to make potions, and I want to add blue colored paint to the water and red colored paint to this water, and I'm going to mix it and see what color it makes. And all of that stuff, that's kind of like kids' grand plan, that they're geniuses and that they want to continue this genius. I don't want to hinder that process as much as possible by saying, you're spilling a lot of water on the floor, And in fact, I was watching a video by Neil deGrasse Tyson. Has anybody seen this video where he encourages parents to let kids open the fridge, take an egg out of the fridge, and let them drop it on the floor so that they can observe biology turning into physics? Do you get the reference? The egg is now splattered on the floor, so you're watching gravity happen and then mess on your kitchen floor, right? And I was like, I agree with you, Neil. He's basically saying, like, scientists are children that never grew up. They're constantly, like, pushing the limits to see, like, what happens when you do X, Y, or Z. But I was looking at the comments underneath the video, because you can read all the comments, and a bunch of parents wrote, I would like them to do that at your house, Dr. deGrasse Tyson. Is that okay? But I think the gist of what he was trying to say was he really believes that, like, the innovators, the scientists, the tech entrepreneurs, all these people, they basically push past limits a lot of the time. They're not really constrained by limits so much. So, do we need to set as many limits with our kids when they're in that creative mode? I don't know. I want to tell you what's happening in their brains while they're in that creative mode. So the downstairs brain that I just referenced, that's actually, if you put your hand on the base of your skull, right above your neck, that's where your brain stem is. It's the part of your brain that connects your body and your nervous system and all your organs and stuff to the rest of your hardware up here. The lower brain and part of your midbrain limbic system, which is sort of the housing of your ability to read emotions and be really emotionally smart. If the brainstem is right here, this is your neck and here's the brainstem, the emotional midbrain is kind of over that, and then your prefrontal cortex sort of houses the whole thing at the right underneath your skull, like this. So we're really looking at the lower structures of the brain when we look at this section here. This is kind of like the research and development section of the brain. It's a very reactive part of the brain, actually. It was initially, like, babies need this part of the brain fully developed at birth because it ensures our survival. If there was a threat in the environment and a young child were to see it, it's this part of the brain that sends a signal to them before they can even perceive it. A stranger's walked in the room, where's my mom and dad? I'm gonna go straight for them. Before they don't even have conscious thought. You know how your child, if you went, I don't know, out somewhere and they saw something that didn't look quite right, they'd be jetting back over to you. It actually ensures our evolution, that it ensures our survival. The brainstem's really important for that reason. But this neuroscientist, Jaak Panksepp, I don't know where he's from exactly. I want to guess the Netherlands. He actually passed away last year. He was a professor at Bowling Green State University. He did rodent research. So he studied the brains of rats because they're a close mammalian relation to our brains as humans. But what he was looking at was if you surgically remove the top part of the brain from rats, he wanted to know if they would still play, if they'd still like initiate play and do like rough and tumble stuff with each other, which is really key for their development because it helps them build the skills that they need to survive in the wild. 10 minutes. He found that rats still played even without their cortexes of their brain, the upstairs brain. So they believe the lower brain is actually the initiation area of creativity. It's where ideas spark from. Our kids can do and try and experiment and grow that way. So the bottom part of this brain, if you can imagine, this is like your child's brain is like this fast-growing company where the downstairs is like the R&D department, where they're basically building a Mars rover on one side of the lab, and the other side of the lab is this organic chemistry experiment where they're just churning out ideas as fast as they can. That's why if a young child, like a 3 or 4-year-old, came in this room, what do you think that they would do if they walked in this room right now? Run. There's a great runway right here, right? My son would be looking around like, ooh, what can I do in here? That's what their brains are driving them to do. That's natural for their development. And I don't want to get in the way of that, but I want to keep them safe, and I want them to start listening to their upstairs brain as much as possible. Because the upstairs brain is actually the CEO, the executive center of the brain that needs time to develop. It needs 30 years to develop, and that's why most of the office space is unoccupied right now. There's just one CEO looking at the 5-year projection going, oh my gosh, don't take your 4-year-old in that gym. You can't imagine what he's going to knock over as soon as he walks in there. This activity in the brain is really, really important to counteract those extremes, those emotional extremes, because the emotional extremes also get initiated in the lower brain too, ironically. When kids are having a meltdown, for example, I know none of our kids have ever had a meltdown, but when your child is in the midst of a meltdown, it's the brainstem that's very active. We could do a functional MRI of your child's brain. We would see that the brainstem is activated, telling your child that they're under threat. You just cut their muffin in half. It's not a real threat. I just tried to put your shoe on. It's not a real threat. But their brain doesn't know the difference. That's really the difference between an actual threat or their perceived threat if they're having the meltdown, right? So it could be over something as simple as cutting the muffin in half. Can't tell the difference. So it's kind of like there's a fire in the lab, in the R&D part of the brain, the lower part of the brain, that we need to put out the fire first. And so a lot of the whole brain techniques that are in Tina and Dan's books are about how to put out the fire in the lower brain first so that we can help kids access the logic that is stored. You know, we need to put out the fire in the lab so we can get the CEO involved in this to help guide decision making from this part. So I can keep you safe and so that we can figure out what to do about wearing shoes from now on, right? I kind of want to touch on the adolescent brain because I mentioned that a lot is going on, and you asked the question, like, do girls' brains mature faster than boys, or does it take a little bit longer for boys' brains to get there and stuff? We know that there's this principle called use it or lose it. We really want our kids to be forming strong connections in the brain around experiences that are going to take their growth forward, or else there's pruning that happens twice. Well, two major times of pruning. Pruning is just what, like I just mentioned before, we keep the strongest connections in the brain and the rest of them get sort of pruned off and wither away. The first episode of pruning happens right after the age of 2. Like I said, 2-year-olds have twice as many synaptic connections than they need, and it's no big deal. It's actually a process of sort of honing what's working really well, wanting to keep that stuff and getting rid of the stuff like around the muffin. Like we can get rid of the connections around that muffin or that shoe, hopefully. The second episode of pruning happens when kids are at these ages, so 11 years old for girls and 12 and a half for boys. So it does happen a little bit later for boys. And what's happening in your teenager's brain and why sometimes it seems like they've reverted back to the 2-year-old kind of functioning a little bit like, get out of my life, I hate you, Mom and Dad, but take me to the mall later, would you? Like, do you know what I mean? It's like this push-pull time, and there's active rebellion and differentiation, but they still need the linkage with us as parents at the same time, even if they don't want to admit it. They still very much need linkage with us in order to keep maturing and developing that CEO brain. So what we need to remember is that their brains are going through this very active pruning process that they're not in control of. We used to think that teenagers were just hormonal. And actually there are some changes in the levels of chemicals in the body, but a lot of that goes back to what's happening in the brain. If you can imagine your teenager's brain or your 11, 12 and a half year old brain as a kitchen that's undergoing remodeling. Has anybody ever had their kitchen remodeled? It's the worst, right? Like you feel displaced, you're unsettled, you don't have access to all the stuff that you need just to be able to do the simplest thing. There's a lot of chaos during that time and reorganization that's happening. And so when we look at the preteen brain, when kids are just starting to go through that, not only are there a whole nother set of social pressures to entering middle school, getting ready for high school, but internally, inside their neurobiology, they're really going through this whole remodeling process that's just making everything seem like it's going haywire. And I wanted to mention Dan Siegel's book, Brainstorm, as a view. I'm sorry if you're just about to enter the adolescent years. I'm in for it soon, too. I've got 5 minutes. Oh, my goodness. All right. What's our I'm going to skip a couple, but I want to hit on the most important points. One of the ways that we can help kids get integrated between the downstairs brain and the upstairs brain is to value their creativity and their ways of problem solving. For example, like, I would let your kid drop the egg from the fridge, but I might have a plastic container underneath it, you know? Have you ever tried to clean up an egg off the ground? I have. Not fun. It sort of scoots around everywhere. So we do need to be able to set limits around our kids' behavior, but at the Center for Connection, because everything we do is based on this whole brain, sort of brain integration approach, we really take a different kind of approach to discipline. We still believe in discipline, but like I said, sometimes kids, when in their emotional reactions or their anxiety or these pseudo-trauma states that they go through because something might seem too challenging or too much, or they just don't like what's going on, we try and get in there and offer soothing first. We want to soothe their bodies. We want to soothe the lower parts of their brain first. So we connect before we redirect. I want to make sure that my son, who's just kicked the shoe off and it's hit me in the face, although I do want to strangle him, or do something else that would be very much coming from my lower brain reactivity, I want to make sure I can soothe myself and show myself compassion, like, yeah, that really hurt, and that's not a behavior that I want him to continue, but I also want him to wear shoes on a daily basis. So before I discipline, I want to make sure that I soothe his nervous system. So I want to continually be that secure attachment figure, that loving bond between us remains intact. So instead of sort of getting angry, shaming him, or this, that, and the other, maybe yelling and, telling him that was wrong and he should never do it again, I want to make sure that I'm connecting at the bottom first. And I might do that by sort of helping him calm, finding ways to help him calm and get better regulated. This newer term called self-regulation or co-regulation is really our ability to help our kids get calmer faster when their emotions get stirred up, and that often looks like misbehavior or defiance against us. And so thank you, what can we do to help create a system between us in our relationship, between our child and ourselves as parents, where I can motivate my child? What skills do they need? How can I motivate my child to be on board with this? And how do I not stifle their creativity, but encourage their creativity to help find solutions in the moment of what we should do about this? So often we think of discipline both as offering limits, but soothing first, then offering limits, but making sure that we're teaching and skill building all throughout that process. So we ask ourselves a lot of questions when we approach behavior, like, why is my child behaving this way? Could this be a stress reaction? Is it possible this behavior is the best they can do given the circumstances? So could this behavior be their most adaptive reaction to this particular situation or this particular moment? So when you're approaching your child, it's very helpful to remember, like, there are different parts of the brain, and we want to try and take a bottom-up approach to help raise innovative kids that are involved in the process of trying to figure out what should we do about this when I'm in a calm, receptive state, not when I'm in the angry, overwhelmed, non-receptive, I can't learn in this situation because I'm too overactivated in my lower brain to even hear what you're saying. Anybody's kids get so upset or in such a big meltdown that you're talking to them, but they can't hear a word. They can't hear a word that you're saying. It's actually because the upstairs brain has gone dark until we calm those emotions down. I've been trying to think about what is going to be the best way for me to help you calm down first, and then we'll approach the problem together. So we're really about supporting the lower brain, soothing the emotional brain, and strengthening the executive functioning of the brain, the part of the brain that would go, yeah, I know, it's a whole muffin. I get it. And just to finish up here, we want to remember that it all goes back to attachment. That playfulness and being really curious and being creative as parents, being able to keep our wits about us and think through why is this behavior happening? What can I do to help? How can I be here for you? And how can we stay creative in this moment? It's a core element of attachment, which forms when our babies are born. It develops the attunement between ourselves and our kids, necessary so that our kids can learn the emotional regulation ability, the ability to calm the storm, stay calm in the storm, be able to think of the innovative solution that they need in the moment with our help, especially in the younger ages, but also in the teenage stages, so that they will continue to develop healthy relationships moving forward. Our goal is not just to get our kids through, our goal is to help our kids thrive into adulthood and be successful in the long run. So when we're creatively responding, we can build a lifelong template for emotional regulation and resilience, their ability to bounce back from difficulty and stress. So thank you so much for letting me go on this a while longer to take questions, or if you want to run things past me and see what I think, or I can answer questions about what we do at the Center for Connection, anything that you're wondering. But thank you so much. You've been such a wonderfully attentive audience, and I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. Thank you.